The year was 1965, and New York City pulsed with a rhythm all its own. In the smoky depths of Greenwich Village, where narrow streets twisted like saxophone riffs and neon signs cast red and blue shadows on rain-slicked pavement, there existed a world within a world. This was the kingdom of jazz, where music spoke louder than words, and a man's worth was measured not by the color of his skin, but by the soul he could pour through his instrument. The Blue Note stood on the corner of 3rd Street and MacDougal, its weathered brick facade adorned with hand-painted posters announcing the evening's performers. Inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the amber glow of stage lights. Round tables crowded the floor, each one occupied by poets in black turtlenecks, artists with paint-stained fingers, college students seeking enlightenment, and uptown sophisticates slumming it for a taste of authentic culture. The walls were decorated with photographs of legends who had graced this very stage. Miles, Coltrane, Mingus, Monk. But tonight, all eyes were on one man. Othello Moore commanded the stage like a general leading troops into glorious battle. His ebony skin glistened under the spotlight as his fingers danced across the trumpet's valves, coaxing sounds that seemed to come from some divine source. He wore a charcoal suit perfectly tailored to his broad shoulders, a thin black tie, and a white shirt unbuttoned just enough to suggest the passionate fire that burned within. At 38 years old, he had risen from the cotton fields of Mississippi to become the most celebrated jazz musician in America. His latest album, Midnight Confessions, had spent 16 weeks at the top of the charts, and critics called him the voice of a generation struggling to find itself. Behind him, the quartet swayed in perfect synchronization. There was Casio Rivera on piano, a 26-year-old prodigy with Puerto Rican heritage and fingers that could make the keys weep or sing with equal facility. His youthful enthusiasm and movie star looks had made him a favorite among the female patrons, and his recent promotion to lead pianist had been celebrated in all the music magazines. On drums sat Amelia Ives, a fierce woman with short-cropped hair and arms that moved with mechanical precision, keeping time with an almost mathematical perfection. And on bass stood Iago Bennett. Iago was a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, dressed in a perpetually rumpled brown suit. His face bore the kind of hardness that came from years of watching others receive the recognition he felt was rightfully his. At 42, he had been in the music business since he was 16, had played with everyone who mattered, had written arrangements that became standards. Yet somehow, success had always eluded him. He stood in shadows while others bathed in spotlight. He was the manager now, the arranger, the behind-the-scenes man who made Othello Moore sound like a god. And he smiled his thin smile, while resentment grew like poison ivy around his heart. The set ended with a flourish, and the crowd erupted in applause that shook the rafters. Othello lowered his trumpet and nodded graciously, his eyes scanning the audience with the calm confidence of a man who had finally found his place in a world that had tried to deny him one. But then his gaze stopped, caught by something that made his expression shift from professional satisfaction to something deeper, something dangerous. She sat at a front-row table, alone except for a glass of red wine and a small leather notebook. Desdemona Brabantio was unlike any woman who typically frequented the village jazz clubs. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves to her shoulders, styled in the fashionable flip that Jackie Kennedy had made famous. She wore a simple, cream-colored dress with a string of pearls that probably cost more than most people in the room made in a year. Everything about her screamed Upper East Side privilege, Vassar education, debutante balls, and country club memberships. Yet here she sat, in this basement club in the village, her blue eyes fixed on Othello with an intensity that made the air between them crackle with electricity. This was not their first encounter. For 3 weeks now, she had appeared at every performance, always alone, always in the front row, always with that same look of absolute fascination. Othello had noticed her from the first night, how could he not? But he had maintained his distance, knowing the dangerous waters that surrounded any involvement between a black man and a white woman from society's upper echelons. He had seen careers destroyed, lives ruined, bodies found floating in rivers. The year was 1965, and while Bob Dylan might sing about the times changing, the old hatreds died hard. As the crowd began to disperse into the village night, Desdemona remained seated, her pen moving across the pages of her notebook with practiced precision. She was a writer for Downbeat magazine, though few knew it. Her articles appeared under the byline D.B. White, a careful disguise that allowed her to move through the jazz world without the burden of her family name. The Brabantios were old New York money, the kind of family whose ancestors had bought Manhattan real estate when it was still measured in beaver pelts. Her father, Senator Marcus Brabantio, served on the Senate Judiciary Committee and had built his political career on law and order, traditional values, and what he called preserving the American way of life. But Desdemona had always been drawn to the music that her father's generation dismissed as corrupted noise. She had discovered jazz at Barnard College, sneaking out of her dormitory to catch late-night sets in Harlem clubs where her presence raised eyebrows, but her genuine appreciation for the music eventually earned respect. After graduation, she had convinced her editor at Downbeat that she could provide an insider's perspective on the downtown scene. What she hadn't expected was to fall under the spell of a musician whose talent transcended every boundary society had tried to construct. Othello approached her table with the careful grace of a man accustomed to navigating dangerous social terrain. His trumpet case hung from his shoulder, and perspiration still glistened on his forehead from the intensity of the performance. The club was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers nursing drinks, and the staff wiping down tables with practiced efficiency. "Miss," he began, his voice carrying the same rich resonance that colored his musical phrases. "Brabantio," she replied, closing her notebook and looking up into eyes that held depths she wanted to explore. "Desdemona Brabantio. And I know exactly who you are, Mr. Moore. Your interpretation of Body and Soul tonight was extraordinary. You took Hawkins' original and made it entirely your own while still honoring the tradition." Othello felt something shift inside his chest, a flutter that had nothing to do with stage nerves. Women had approached him before, drawn by fame or exotic fascination, but this was different. This woman understood the music, spoke its language, appreciated the delicate balance between innovation and reverence that defined true artistry. "You're very kind," he said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "May I?" She nodded, and as he sat, she noticed the calluses on his fingertips from years of pressing trumpet valves, the slight scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. These were details that spoke of a life lived fully, authentically, without the careful preservation that characterized her own world. From across the room, Iago watched this interaction with growing interest. He had been packing up his bass, moving slowly to observe the dynamics unfolding at that front table. Iago Bennett had an instinct for human weakness, could smell vulnerability and desire like a predator sensing wounded prey. In 30 years of managing musicians, he had learned that the most dangerous moments came not from business dealings or artistic disagreements, but from matters of the heart. Love, he knew, made brilliant men stupid and careful men reckless. The conversation between Othello and Desdemona continued in low tones, punctuated by her musical laugh and his deep chuckles. She told him about growing up surrounded by classical music and cotillion dances, about discovering Django Reinhardt records hidden in her brother's bedroom, about the thrill of hearing real jazz for the first time in a Harlem basement where she was the only white face in a crowd of 200. He spoke of Mississippi cotton fields where workers sang spirituals that became the blues, of saving every penny to buy his first trumpet from a pawn shop in Memphis, of the night Miles Davis had shaken his hand after a set and said he had something special. As they talked, the walls between their worlds began to dissolve. They discovered shared passions for poetry and late-night walks, for Coltrane's spiritual searching, and Billie Holiday's raw honesty. They debated whether bebop had lost jazz's emotional core or elevated it to new heights of intellectual sophistication. They found themselves leaning closer across the small table, their voices dropping to intimate whispers as if they were sharing state secrets instead of musical preferences. Cassio Rivera finished packing his piano sheet music and approached their table with his characteristic boyish enthusiasm. "Othello, man, that was incredible tonight. The way you built that solo on Autumn Leaves." He stopped abruptly, noticing Desdemona and suddenly conscious of intruding on what appeared to be a private moment. "Cassio, I'd like you to meet Miss Brabantio. She's a writer for Downbeat." The young pianist's eyes widened with recognition and excitement. "No kidding? I read your piece on the Latin influence in modern jazz. You really captured something the other critics missed." Desdemona smiled warmly. "You must be Cassio Rivera. Your work tonight was outstanding. That quote of Chopin you wove into the bridge of All of Me was inspired." As the three of them chatted, none of them noticed Iago moving closer, his expression carefully neutral while his mind catalogued every detail of this developing triangle. The conversation continued until well past midnight, when the Blue Note staff began stacking chairs and mopping floors around them. Desdemona glanced at her watch, a delicate Cartier piece that caught the remaining stage lights, and realized how late it had become. In her world, proper young ladies didn't linger in village clubs until the small hours, certainly not in the company of men their fathers would never approve of. But as Othello offered to walk her to where she could catch a taxi back to the Upper East Side, propriety seemed like a relic from another era. They stepped out into the cool September night, where the narrow streets of Greenwich Village held the lingering echoes of conversation, laughter, and distant music spilling from other basement clubs. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light on the sidewalk, and the air carried the scent of coffee from the all-night diner on the corner. "This has been," Desdemona began, then paused, searching for words that seemed inadequate. "I've covered hundreds of musicians for the magazine, but I've never met anyone who understands music the way you do. It's not just technique or talent, it's like you're channeling something deeper." Othello stopped walking and turned to face her under a streetlight, their shadows merging on the cobblestone. "Music is the only language that tells the truth," he said quietly. "When I play, I can't lie about who I am or where I come from or what I feel. Maybe that's why it scares some people." She reached out and touched his hand, a gesture that in 1965 America carried weight beyond its simple intimacy. "It doesn't scare me." That touch, lasting only seconds, changed everything. 2 blocks away, Iago emerged from the Blue Note stage door, having witnessed their departure through the club's front window. He lit a cigarette and began following at a discreet distance, his photographer's mind already composing the shots he would not take but would remember. The interracial couple silhouetted under street lamps, her blonde hair catching light while his dark skin absorbed shadows, their hands briefly touching in a gesture that could destroy careers and lives. Meanwhile, in a mahogany-paneled study on East 74th Street, Senator Marcus Brabantio sat behind his desk reviewing legislative papers when his telephone rang. The caller was Rodrigo Montano, a family friend and hopeful suitor for Desdemona's hand, a young man from proper stock, whose grandfather had built shipping fortunes and whose own ambitions ran toward diplomatic service. "Senator, I hate to disturb you so late." Rodrigo's voice carried anxiety and barely contained anger. "But I thought you should know. Desdemona was spotted tonight at one of those jazz clubs in the village, with that Negro musician, Othello Moore. They appeared quite intimate." The senator's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information. He had been aware of his daughter's inappropriate interest in what he called jungle music, had tolerated her writing career as a harmless phase, but this crossed every line of acceptable behavior. In his world, reputation was everything, and scandal could destroy political careers with the efficiency of a perfectly aimed bullet. Back in the village, Othello and Desdemona reached the corner where she would catch her taxi. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and danger in equal measure. She looked into his eyes and saw vulnerability beneath the confidence, loneliness behind the success. A man who had conquered the music world but remained isolated by the very achievements that had elevated him. "I want to see you again," she said, her voice steady despite the implications of those words. "You know what you're asking?" he replied, his tone gentle but serious. "Your world and mine, they don't overlap without consequences." "Then maybe it's time to create a new world," she answered, stepping closer. "One where the only thing that matters is what we feel for each other." As her taxi approached, its headlights cutting through the village darkness, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street, or the way Iago Bennett smiled his thin smile before dropping his cigarette and grinding it under his heel. The pieces were falling into place exactly as he had hoped they would, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities to nurture the seeds of destruction that had been planted tonight. The yellow cab pulled away toward uptown, carrying Desdemona back to her gilded cage, while Othello walked slowly back toward his apartment, his mind replaying every word, every glance, every moment of connection that had just altered the trajectory of his carefully constructed life. 3 weeks had passed since that first encounter, and the autumn of 1965 had settled over New York like a jazz melody complex, unpredictable, and tinged with both beauty and melancholy. The leaves in Washington Square Park had turned to burnished gold and crimson, falling like scattered sheet music across the pathways, where poets and protesters gathered beneath the arch. The city hummed with change. Bob Dylan had gone electric at Newport, the Beatles were conquering America, and civil rights marchers were making headlines from Selma to Detroit. But in the intimate world of Greenwich Village jazz clubs, time seemed suspended in amber light and cigarette smoke. The Blue Note had become the epicenter of an unlikely romance that was sending ripples through both the downtown music scene and uptown society circles. Every night for the past 3 weeks, Desdemona had appeared at her usual front row table, and every night, after the final set, she and Othello would disappear into the village streets for long walks that stretched until dawn. They had discovered hidden corners of the city together. The all-night bookstore on Bleecker Street, where they browsed poetry collections and debated Langston Hughes versus Allen Ginsberg. The tiny Italian restaurant where the owner, Tony, served them linguine vongole at 2 in the morning while Sinatra crooned from an ancient jukebox. The pier, overlooking the Hudson River, where they sat on wooden benches and watched tugboats navigate the dark waters, while sharing stories of their vastly different childhoods. Tonight, the club was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through the underground network of jazz enthusiasts that something electric was happening at the Blue Note, that Othello Moore was playing with a passion that transcended his already legendary reputation. Music journalists from Rolling Stone and Village Voice occupied corner tables, their notebooks filled with attempts to capture the indefinable magic that occurred when Othello lifted his trumpet to his lips and poured his heart through the gleaming brass. Iago Bennett moved through the crowd like a shark through dark waters, his bass slung across his back, his eyes constantly scanning the room for opportunities. He had spent the past 3 weeks carefully cultivating relationships, planting seeds of gossip, and positioning himself as the concerned friend who only wanted to protect his famous employer from making a career-destroying mistake. His targets were carefully chosen: Marcus Whitman, the influential A&R executive from Columbia Records, who could make or break recording contracts; Detective Ray Sullivan, an off-duty cop whose beat included the village, and who harbored the casual racism common to many Irish-American officers of his generation; and most importantly, Rodrigo Montano, whose family connections and burning jealousy made him the perfect instrument of destruction. Tonight's performance was particularly intense. Othello had chosen a program of romantic standards: Body and Soul, My Funny Valentine, The Way You Look Tonight. But his interpretations were revolutionary. He played each melody as if he were writing love letters in the air, his trumpet singing with a vulnerability that left the audience breathless. Cassio's piano provided the perfect counterpoint, his youthful enthusiasm tempering Othello's mature passion with playful innocence. The chemistry between the two musicians was undeniable, their musical conversation flowing like brothers who had been separated at birth and reunited through the miracle of jazz. From her front row table, Desdemona watched with eyes that had learned to see beyond the performance to the man behind the music. She had spent the past 3 weeks discovering layers of complexity in Othello that her privileged background had never prepared her to understand. He was simultaneously confident and vulnerable, worldly and innocent, proud and humble. In quiet moments between sets, he had shared stories of growing up in Mississippi, of picking cotton while dreaming of stages like this one, of the night he had first heard Louis Armstrong on a crackling radio and knew that music was his salvation. She had told him about her own prison of privilege, about cotillion dances, where she felt like an actress playing a role written by someone else, about the pressure to marry within her social circle and produce the next generation of acceptable society children. They had discovered that they were both exiles in their own ways, he from the world that had produced him, she from the world that claimed to own her. As the first set ended and the crowd erupted in applause, Iago made his move. He approached Roderigo Montano, who sat alone at a back table nursing his third whiskey and wearing an expression of barely controlled rage. Roderigo was 28 years old, heir to a shipping fortune, and utterly convinced that Desdemona would be his bride if not for the spell that this jazz musician had somehow cast over her. Terrible thing. Watching her throw her life away, Iago said quietly, sliding into the chair beside Roderigo. A woman like that, with her breeding, her education, her future. And she's risking it all for what? A few moments of excitement with someone who could never understand her world? Roderigo's knuckles whitened around his glass. There has to be something we can do. Her father is Senator Brabantio, for God's sake. This kind of scandal could destroy his career. Iago nodded sympathetically, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. Perhaps if someone were to document their relationship, photographs, witnesses, evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. Sometimes people need to be saved from their own poor judgment. The second set began with a haunting rendition of Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday's devastating protest song that still carried the power to silence rooms and change hearts. Othello's trumpet wailed with the anguish of centuries, each note a cry for justice that seemed to rise from some primal source of human suffering. The audience sat transfixed, even the cynical music journalists abandoning their note-taking to simply listen. In the front row, tears streamed down Desdemona's cheeks as she witnessed artistry that transcended entertainment and became prophecy. But the most profound moment came when Othello transitioned into an original composition he had never performed publicly before. The melody began as a whisper, tentative and searching, like a question posed to the darkness. Gradually, it gained confidence and complexity, weaving together influences from Mississippi blues, New Orleans jazz, and European classical traditions. This was his musical autobiography, the story of a man who had traveled impossible distances to stand on this stage and bare his soul to strangers. As the song reached its climax, Othello's eyes found Desdemona's across the smoky room, and in that moment, every person in the Blue Note understood they were witnessing something beyond performance. This was a love song, written in real time. A musical proposal that required no words, no traditional gestures, no social conventions. The trumpet sang what his heart could not risk, speaking aloud in a world that criminalized their feelings. When the set ended, the applause was thunderous but brief, as if the audience recognized they had witnessed something too sacred for prolonged celebration. Othello set down his trumpet and walked directly to Desdemona's table, his usual post-performance routine abandoned. Without speaking, he extended his hand, and she rose to take it, her notebook forgotten on the table beside her half-empty wine glass. They walked out into the October night, past the clusters of fans who normally surrounded Othello after performances, past the music journalists calling out questions, past everything that belonged to his public life. The village streets were alive with weekend energy students from NYU debating politics on corner, artists carrying canvases toward late-night gallery openings, couples ducking into coffee shops and bookstores that stayed open until dawn. But Othello and Desdemona moved through it all as if they were invisible. protected by the intensity of what had just occurred between them on that stage. They found themselves in Washington Square Park, beneath the great arch that stood like a monument to all the dreams and disappointments that had played out in its shadow. The fountain was silent at this hour, surrounded by empty benches where during daylight hours, folk singers performed for coins, and philosophers debated the meaning of existence. Now, in the pale light of street lamps filtered through autumn leaves, it felt like their private cathedral. "That song," Desdemona said softly, her breath visible in the cooling air. "You wrote that for me." "I wrote it for us," Othello replied, his deep voice carrying a vulnerability that few people had ever heard. "For what we could be if the world would let us." She reached into her purse and withdrew a small velvet box, the kind that usually contained jewelry passed down through generations of wealthy families. Inside was a silver locket, antique and beautifully crafted, engraved with musical notes that formed an intricate pattern around its circumference. When opened, it revealed a tiny photograph of her taken at her Barnard graduation, and on the opposite side, an inscription: "For the music that matters most." "This belonged to my grandmother," she said, fastening the delicate chain around his neck. "She was the only person in my family who ever understood why I loved jazz. She used to sneak out to Harlem clubs in the 1920s, back when it was even more scandalous than it is now. She said music was the only thing that made her feel alive." Othello touched the locket with reverent fingers, understanding the weight of what she had just given him. In her world, family heirlooms were not shared lightly. Certainly not with men who existed outside the boundaries of acceptable society. This was more than a gift. It was a declaration of war against everything her upbringing had taught her to value. Meanwhile, across the park, concealed behind a cluster of oak trees, Iago crouched with a telephoto camera borrowed from a photographer friend at the Village Voice. The images he captured in the moonlight told a story that would be worth more than gold in the right hands. The interracial couple embracing beneath the arch, the moment when she placed the necklace around his throat, their faces illuminated by street lamps as they kissed with the passion of people who knew their time together might be limited by forces beyond their control. But Iago was not content to simply document their relationship. He had spent years studying human nature, learning how to identify the pressure points that could crack even the strongest foundations. As he watched Othello and Desdemona lose themselves in each other's arms, he was already planning the next phase of his campaign. The photographs would be useful, but they were just the beginning. Real destruction required patience, creativity, and an understanding of exactly which lies would be most readily believed. Tomorrow, he would begin planting seeds of doubt in fertile ground, starting with Cassio Rivera, whose innocence and good nature made him the perfect unwitting accomplice in his own destruction. Cassio sat at the studio piano, watching his mentor struggle with the impossible choice between his art and his heart. The young pianist had witnessed Othello's transformation over the past weeks, how love had elevated his music to transcendent heights, how happiness had unlocked new depths of creativity and passion. Now, watching that same man fumble through scales that should have been second nature, Cassio understood that some battles couldn't be won with talent alone. "Maybe we should take a break," Cassio suggested gently, his fingers finding a soft, comforting melody on the keys. "Let things cool down for a few days. Let the press move on to the next scandal." But Othello knew better. In America, 1965, some scandals didn't simply blow over. They lingered like smoke in closed rooms, poisoning the air for years to come. "There won't be a next album," he said quietly, setting down his trumpet with the care of a man laying a loved one to rest. "They've made their position clear." Whitman's voice crackled through the intercom with the hollow tone of a man delivering a death sentence he didn't want to pronounce. "The board met this morning. They're invoking the morals clause in your contract. I fought for you, Othello. You have to believe that. But the shareholders, the distributors, the radio stations, they're all asking the same questions about your judgment, your reliability, your ability to represent the label's values." The irony was devastating. Othello Moore, who had spent his career breaking down racial barriers through the universal language of music, was being destroyed not for his blackness, which the industry had learned to market as exotic authenticity, but for his love of a white woman, which threatened the carefully maintained social boundaries that even liberal record executives dared not cross. 20 blocks downtown, in the cramped office of Downbeat magazine, Desdemona sat across from her editor, Harold Morrison, a chain-smoking jazz enthusiast who had built his career on recognizing talent before the mainstream caught on. The magazine that had been her refuge, her platform for celebrating the music she loved, was now the scene of her professional execution. "I'm sorry, Des," Morrison said, using the nickname he had given her during her first week on the job. "The pressure's coming from everywhere: advertisers, distributors, even some of the musicians we cover regularly. They're afraid of being associated with the controversy." She had expected this moment, had prepared herself for it during the sleepless nights since the scandal broke. But the reality of losing her voice, her ability to write about the music that had become her life's passion, still felt like a physical blow. So that's it? 5 years of work? Dozens of articles that helped launch careers and preserve history, all erased because I fell in love with the wrong man? Morrison crushed out his cigarette with more force than necessary, his weathered face reflecting the conflict between personal friendship and business necessity. "In 6 months, maybe a year, when this blows over." "It won't blow over, Harry, and you know it." Desdemona stood, gathering her dignity around her, like armor. "Some lines, once you cross them, you can never uncross. Some choices mark you forever." As she walked toward the door, Morrison called after her with genuine regret in his voice. "For what it's worth, I think that piece you wrote about Othello, the one about music transcending boundaries, it was the best thing we ever published." She paused at the doorway, her hand on the brass handle that had once opened doors to the most exclusive corners of the jazz world. "The best things usually are the ones that cost us everything," she replied, and stepped out into the harsh light of a world that had no place for the love she and Othello had dared to claim. November rain hammered the windows of the Blue Note like accusatory fingers, and the club that had once been Othello's sanctuary now felt more like a courtroom where he was perpetually on trial. 6 weeks had passed since the scandal broke, and the fallout had been swift and merciless. Columbia Records had postponed his album indefinitely. 3 major television appearances had been canceled. The jazz critics, who had once hailed him as the voice of his generation, now wrote carefully neutral reviews that praised his technical skill while pointedly avoiding any mention of his personal life. But Othello Moore was not a man who surrendered easily. If mainstream America wanted to reject him, he would create his own kingdom in the underground world of village clubs and late-night sessions. Tonight, the Blue Note was packed, despite or perhaps because of the controversy. The audience was different now. Fewer uptown sophisticates, more true believers who came not for social status but for the pure communion of music. Among them sat writers from underground newspapers, civil rights activists who saw his relationship with Desdemona as a symbol of social progress, and young interracial couples who found courage in his defiance of convention. Desdemona occupied her usual front-row table, but the comfortable confidence she had once radiated was now replaced by a brittle determination. The past 6 weeks had cost her everything she had once taken for granted. Her father had cut off her trust fund and banned her from the family home. Her byline had disappeared from Downbeat magazine after pressure from advertisers. Old friends crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her, and the doormen at her former haunts had received instructions not to admit her. Yet here she sat, night after night, her loyalty unwavering even as her world crumbled around her. The music that poured from Othello's trumpet had evolved during these weeks of siege. Where once his style had been sophisticated and urbane, now it carried the raw power of spirituals and work songs, the defiant cry of a man who would not be broken. His rendition of "We Shall Overcome" brought the audience to its feet, transforming the civil rights anthem into something that transcended politics and became pure human expression. Cassio Rivera's role had expanded during this period of crisis. As mainstream venues closed their doors to Othello, Cassio had used his family connections in the Puerto Rican community to arrange performances at smaller clubs throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn. His youthful energy and untainted reputation made him an effective ambassador, able to navigate social circles that were now forbidden to his mentor. Tonight, he had exciting news. Tito Puente wanted to arrange a collaboration that could open doors to an entirely new audience. But Iago Bennett watched these developments with growing alarm. His carefully orchestrated plan to destroy Othello was succeeding too well. Instead of retreating in shame, his target was becoming more powerful, more authentic, more dangerous to Iago's own ambitions. The scandal had purified Othello rather than weakening him, stripping away the commercial compromises that had diluted his art. Meanwhile, Cassio's rising prominence as the liaison to the Latin jazz community threatened to eclipse Iago's own position as the power behind the throne. During the break between sets, Iago approached Desdemona's table with his characteristic smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had been cultivating a relationship with her over the past weeks, positioning himself as the loyal friend who understood the pressures she and Othello faced. "Difficult times," he said, settling into the chair beside her without invitation. "But I have to admire your courage, sticking by him when so many others have abandoned ship." Desdemona studied him carefully. Something in Iago's tone suggested sympathy, but his eyes held a calculating coldness that made her uncomfortable. "Love isn't conditional on public approval, Mr. Bennett. I thought you understood that." Of course, Iago replied, signaling the waitress for a drink. "Though I do worry about Othello sometimes. The pressure is getting to him, and when men like him feel cornered." He paused dramatically, allowing silence to suggest implications he didn't dare speak aloud. "What are you trying to say?" Desdemona's voice carried a warning that Iago chose to ignore. "Nothing specific, you understand. Just that talented men often have appetites that match their artistic passion. The young Puerto Rican pianist, for instance, Cassio. He's been spending a lot of private time with Othello lately, arranging these new bookings. They seem quite close." The seed was planted with surgical precision. Iago knew that Desdemona's privileged background had left her naive about certain realities of the music world, and her isolation during the recent scandal had made her more vulnerable to suggestion. He watched her face carefully, noting the flicker of uncertainty that crossed her features before she recovered her composure. "Cassio is helping us because he's a good friend and a professional musician," she said firmly. "I won't listen to insinuations about either of them." Iago raised his hands in mock surrender. "You're absolutely right to defend them both. I'm probably seeing threats where none exist. The stress of recent events has made me paranoid, I suppose." As December arrived with its bitter winds and early darkness, the poison Iago had been administering began to take effect. Othello's performances grew increasingly erratic, alternating between moments of transcendent brilliance and passages where his trumpet seemed to voice doubts and fears that his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. The silver locket that Desdemona had given him had become both talisman and torment, something he touched obsessively during quiet moments, as if trying to divine truth from its engraved musical notes. The catalyst came on a Tuesday night, when the Blue Note was hosting an informal jam session. Musicians from across the village had gathered to play together in the spontaneous collaboration that made jazz a living art form. Cassio sat at the piano, his fingers dancing across keys that seemed to anticipate his thoughts, while Othello stood center stage with his trumpet gleaming under the amber lights. The music they created together was magical. Two generations of jazz traditions speaking to each other in a language that transcended words. During a break between songs, Cassio approached Othello with genuine concern etched across his youthful features. "Man, you seem tense tonight. Everything cool between you and Desdemona?" I noticed she looked upset when she left during the first set. Othello's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Desdemona had indeed left early, claiming a headache, but her departure had followed a brief conversation with Iago that Othello had observed from across the room. "We're fine. he said curtly, then immediately regretted his tone. Cassio was his protege, his musical brother, and didn't deserve to bear the brunt of anxieties he couldn't even name. Look, if you need to talk, Cassio began. But Othello was already walking away, his trumpet case swinging from his shoulder like a weapon. From his position near the bar, Iago watched this interaction with satisfaction. The next phase of his plan required perfect timing and a prop that would make his lies irrefutable. He had spent the afternoon in a pawn shop on the Lower East Side, purchasing a silver locket nearly identical to the one Desdemona had given Othello. The differences were subtle. This one was slightly more tarnished, its engraving less precise, but in dim light, under emotional duress, such details would be overlooked. The opportunity came the following evening when Cassio arrived early for sound check. Iago had planted the fake locket in the piano bench, where Cassio kept his sheet music, positioning it so it would appear to have fallen from someone's pocket. When the young pianist discovered it, Iago was conveniently nearby to witness the moment. "That's odd," Cassio muttered, holding the locket up to catch the stage lights. "Someone must have dropped this." Iago moved closer, his expression shifting from casual interest to shocked recognition. "Jesus, Cassio, where did you get that?" "I just found it in my music case." "Why? Do you recognize it?" "That's Desdemona's grandmother's locket," Iago said, his voice heavy with implications he didn't need to spell out. "She told me the story behind it weeks ago." "How did it end up with your things?" Cassio's face went pale as the implications sank in. In 1965 America, being accused of any impropriety with a white woman, especially one from a prominent family, could destroy a young musician's career and possibly his life. "Iago, man, I swear I have no idea how this got here. I've never even spoken to her alone. You have to believe me." "Of course I believe you," Iago said soothingly, though his eyes suggested otherwise. "But if Othello finds out you have this, you know how jealous he's been lately. How possessive. Maybe we should keep this between us until we figure out how it ended up in your possession." Meanwhile, 3 blocks away in her small apartment above a village bookstore, Desdemona sat at her typewriter attempting to finish an article about the changing face of jazz in the civil rights era. The words wouldn't come. Every paragraph she wrote seemed to circle back to Othello, to their relationship, to the way love had transformed her from a passive observer of life into someone willing to sacrifice everything for authentic feeling. She reached unconsciously for her grandmother's locket, a gesture that had become habitual during moments of stress or contemplation. Her fingers found only bare skin at her throat. Panic fluttered in her chest as she searched her memory for when she had last seen the precious heirloom. She remembered wearing it to the club 2 nights ago, remembered Othello kissing her goodbye outside her apartment building, but after that, nothing. The locket represented more than sentimental value. It was the physical symbol of her commitment to their relationship, the bridge between her family's history and the future she was trying to create. Its loss felt like an omen, a sign that the forces arrayed against them were more powerful than love alone could overcome. She grabbed her coat and headed back to the Blue Note, hoping someone had found it and turned it in to the lost and found. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Othello was discovering Iago's planted evidence, and the final act of their tragedy was beginning to unfold, with the inexorable rhythm of a funeral march played in 3/4 time. The confrontation erupted like a discordant clash of cymbals in the middle of what should have been a tender ballad. Othello burst through the door of Desdemona's apartment with the fake locket clutched in his trembling fist, his eyes wild with a rage that seemed to consume him from within. The small studio space above the village bookstore, their sanctuary filled with jazz records, poetry books, and photographs of their stolen moments together, suddenly felt like a trap closing around them both. "Explain this," he demanded, thrusting the locket toward her face. His voice, usually rich and melodious, cracked with pain and fury. "Explain how your grandmother's locket, the one you gave me as a symbol of your love, ended up in Cassio's possession." Desdemona stared at the silver chain dangling from his fingers, confusion and terror warring in her blue eyes. "Othello, I don't understand. My locket is." She reached instinctively for her throat and found it bare. "I lost it. I've been looking everywhere for it. When did you find it? Where? Don't lie to me." His voice rose to a roar that seemed to shake the walls. "Iago saw Cassio with it. Saw him handling it like some precious token from his secret lover. How long have you been meeting with him behind my back? How long have you been playing me for a fool?" The accusation hit Desdemona like a physical blow. She stumbled backward against her typewriter desk, scattering papers that contained her unfinished thoughts about love transcending racial boundaries, about music as the universal language of the human heart. "You can't believe that. You know me, Othello. You know what we have together. Cassio is your friend, your protege. He would never." "My protege." Othello laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. "The young, handsome pianist who's been hovering around you for weeks. The one who's supposedly helping us when everyone else has turned away. I was blind, but Iago opened my eyes. He's seen the way Cassio looks at you, the way you encourage his attention." Desdemona felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The past months of scandal and isolation had worn her down, but this betrayal from the man she loved was unbearable. "If you believe Iago over me, then you never knew me at all," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Everything we've sacrificed, everything we've endured together, none of it meant anything if you can so easily believe I would deceive you." Outside, a December snow was beginning to fall, coating the village streets in pristine white that would be trampled gray by morning. Through the apartment's single window, the neon signs of late-night coffee shops and jazz clubs cast fractured rainbows across the walls, painting their confrontation in shifting hues of red and blue and gold. Othello moved closer, his massive frame blocking the light, his shadow falling across her like a judgment. "Show me proof of your innocence," he demanded. "Call Cassio. Have him explain how he came to possess the most precious thing you owned. Make me understand how I can trust anything you say when the evidence condemns you." "The evidence?" Desdemona's voice rose with desperate strength. "What evidence? A locket that I lost and somehow ended up with Cassio. That's not evidence of an affair. That's barely evidence of anything at all. But your willingness to believe the worst about me, that's evidence of something much more damning." She stood and faced him, her small frame dwarfed by his but her spirit unbroken. "You say you love me, but love requires faith. It requires seeing the person you claim to cherish as worthy of trust, not as someone who would betray everything sacred between you for momentary pleasure with a younger man." The apartment fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the soft patter of snow against glass. In that moment, both of them seemed to recognize that something irreparable had been shattered between them. The scandal, the isolation, the pressure from hostile forces outside their relationship, all of that they might have survived together. But this poison that Iago had dripped into Othello's ear, this willingness to believe deception over devotion, had corrupted something that could never be restored to its original purity. Othello's hand went to his throat, touching the silver locket she had given him, the real one, still hanging around his neck. For an instant, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. But the fake locket in his other hand seemed to weigh more than gold, more than truth, more than everything they had built together. The week that followed their confrontation passed like a fever dream played in minor keys. December had transformed Greenwich Village into a landscape of contradiction. Pristine snow covering dirty streets, Christmas lights twinkling above broken hearts, carol singers on corners while tragedy unfolded in basement clubs and walk-up apartments. The Blue Note still opened its doors each evening, but the magic that had once made it legendary seemed to have evaporated like cigarette smoke in winter wind. Othello continued to perform, but his music had changed. Where once his trumpet had sung of love and hope, now it wailed with betrayal and rage. His interpretation of Body and Soul became a funeral dirge. His version of My Funny Valentine dripped with bitter irony. The audiences came expecting the passionate romanticism that had made him famous, but instead, they witnessed the public disintegration of a man whose heart was eating itself alive. Desdemona no longer occupied her front row table. She had retreated to her small apartment above the bookstore, emerging only for essential errands, moving through the village streets like a ghost haunting her former life. The writer who had once captured the essence of jazz with elegant prose now sat before blank pages, her typewriter silent, her inspiration strangled by grief. She had tried calling Cassio to understand how her locket had ended up in his possession, but the young pianist had disappeared from his usual haunts, frightened by implications he didn't fully comprehend. Iago Bennett surveyed the wreckage of his machinations with the satisfaction of an artist admiring a completed masterpiece. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had envisioned. Othello's reputation was in ruins, his relationship with Desdemona destroyed, his music corrupted by pain and paranoia. Soon, very soon, there would be an opening for a new leader in the village jazz scene. Someone who understood both music and the brutal realities of the entertainment business. But Iago had underestimated one crucial factor. Amelia Ives, the drummer whose steady rhythms had anchored Othello's quartet for 3 years. Amelia was a woman who noticed details that escaped others, who observed human behavior with the same precision she applied to keeping time. She had watched Iago's subtle manipulations, had seen him plant seeds of doubt and then nurture them with carefully chosen words and manufactured evidence. On this particular evening, as snow continued to fall outside the Blue Note's windows, Amelia made her decision to act. She arrived early for the evening's performance and found Iago alone in the club's basement storage room, organizing sheet music with the methodical care of a man who planned for every contingency. "We need to talk," she said, her voice carrying the no-nonsense authority that had made her one of the most respected rhythm players in the village. She closed the storage room door behind her, the sound echoing in the small space filled with instrument cases and amplifiers. Iago looked up from his music stands, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious wariness. "Of course, Amelia. What's on your mind?" "The locket," she said simply. Desdemona's grandmother's locket that mysteriously appeared in Cassio's piano case. "Funny thing about that locket, I saw you examining it very carefully in a pawn shop on Houston Street last week. Seemed strange at the time, you shopping for antique jewelry. Makes more sense now." The blood drained from Iago's face, but his voice remained steady. "I don't know what you think you saw, but I know exactly what I saw," Amelia interrupted. "Just like I know you've been poisoning Othello's mind for weeks, feeding his insecurities, turning his love into jealousy. The only question is why. What do you gain from destroying the best thing that's happened to this scene in years?" Iago set down the sheet music and straightened to his full height, his mask of friendly concern finally slipping to reveal the calculating predator beneath. "You're playing a dangerous game, Amelia. Making accusations you can't prove against someone who's been part of this music community for 20 years. 20 years of being passed over, watching other people get the recognition you thought you deserved," she shot back. 20 years of resentment building up until you couldn't stand watching Othello succeed where you failed. The confrontation might have escalated into violence, but at that moment, the storage room door opened, and Cassio Rivera appeared, his young face etched with desperation and fear. He had been hiding from the implications of the planted locket for days, but his conscience had finally driven him to seek the truth. "Iago, man, we need to figure out what happened with that locket. Desdemona's been trying to reach me, and Othello." He stopped abruptly, noticing the tension between Iago and Amelia. "What's going on here?" Amelia turned to face Cassio, her drummer's instincts telling her that this was the moment when all the scattered rhythms would finally synchronize into truth. "Cassio, honey, you need to hear this. Iago here has been playing a very dangerous game, and you've been his unwitting instrument." "I don't understand," Cassio said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Iago's been trying to help me figure out how that locket got into my piano case. He's been as confused as I am." "Confused?" Amelia laughed bitterly. The only thing Iago's confused about is how to explain why he purchased an identical locket from Goldstein's pawn shop last Tuesday afternoon. Isn't that right, you manipulative bastard? Iago's composed facade cracked completely. Cornered like a rat in the narrow storage room, surrounded by the instruments that had been his life's work and witnesses to his greatest failure, he finally revealed the rage that had been consuming him for years. You think you understand what's happening here? You think this is about jealousy or ambition? His voice rose to match the volume of the jazz standards bleeding through the ceiling from the main club above. I've been the backbone of every successful musician in this scene for 2 decades. I wrote the arrangements that made Miles Davis famous. I discovered the chord progressions that Coltrane built his reputation on. I've been the ghost behind every standing ovation, every record deal, every moment of glory that these pretty boys have claimed as their own. Cassio backed toward the door, finally understanding the depth of the deception that had ensnared him. You planted that locket. You wanted Othello to think that Desdemona and I. Brilliant deduction, Iago snarled. Though it took you long enough to figure out. Yes, I planted the locket. Yes, I manufactured evidence of an affair that never existed. Yes, I whispered poison into Othello's ear until his love curdled into murderous jealousy. And you know what? It worked perfectly. Emilia moved closer to Cassio, her protective instincts kicking in as she recognized the dangerous territory they had entered. We need to get upstairs and tell Othello the truth before this goes any further. But Iago blocked their path to the door, his bass guitar slung across his back like a weapon. His eyes wild with the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed lies were collapsing around him. You're not telling anyone anything. You think Othello will thank you for revealing that his precious relationship was destroyed by fabricated evidence? You think Desdemona will forgive him for believing lies over love? Some truths are more destructive than lies. Above them, the sound of Othello's trumpet cut through the normal evening chatter. But something was wrong with the music. Instead of the controlled passion that characterized his performances, this was raw, unfiltered anguish, the sound of a man's soul being torn apart note by note. The melody was strange fruit again, but played with such devastating intensity that conversations died and glasses stopped clinking as the entire club fell under the spell of his suffering. Jesus, Cassio whispered, recognizing the sound of a man on the edge of complete breakdown. We have to stop this now. He lunged for the door, but Iago caught his arm with surprising strength. Stop what? Stop the natural consequences of believing that love can conquer social reality? Stop the inevitable destruction that comes when people refuse to accept their proper places in the world? Stop the destruction you created! Emilia shouted, grabbing a drumstick from her equipment case and wielding it like a club. You sick, twisted man. You've destroyed 3 innocent people because you couldn't handle your own failures. The confrontation might have turned violent, but at that moment, the music above stopped abruptly, as if someone had yanked the needle off a spinning record. The sudden silence was more ominous than any sound could have been. In that quiet, they could hear footsteps on the stairs leading down to the storage level, heavy and purposeful, and carrying the weight of a man who had finally made a decision he could never unmake. Othello appeared in the doorway like an avenging angel carved from midnight, his trumpet case in one hand and murder in his eyes. Behind him, barely visible in the dim stairwell, stood Desdemona, her face pale as December snow, her grandmother's real locket gleaming at her throat, proof of innocence that had arrived too late to prevent the tragedy that was now unfolding with the inexorable rhythm of a funeral march played in the wrong time signature. The basement storage room had become a courtroom where 20 years of resentment stood trial before love, betrayal, and the immutable laws of human consequence. Othello filled the doorway like a thundercloud, his massive frame silhouetted against the amber light filtering down from the club above. In his eyes burned the terrible recognition of a man who had glimpsed the abyss of his own capacity for destruction. "I heard everything," he said, his voice carrying the hollow echo of a trumpet muted by grief. "Every word of your confession, Iago. every detail of your elaborate deception. Desdemona stepped into view beside him, the real locket catching the light at her throat like a beacon of innocence that had arrived too late to prevent the storm. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice remained steady as she addressed the man who had orchestrated their destruction. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why destroy something beautiful just because you couldn't create it yourself?" Iago laughed, a bitter sound that ricocheted off the concrete walls like broken glass. "Beautiful? You call this beautiful? A black man and a white woman playing house while the world burns around them? You think your little love story matters when there are real struggles happening? Real injustices that need fighting? You don't get to hide behind social consciousness," Amelia spat, her drumstick still raised like a weapon. "This wasn't about justice or civil rights. This was about your own pathetic need to tear down anyone who achieved what you couldn't." Cassio pressed himself against the far wall, his young face a portrait of horror as he understood how close he had come to being destroyed by lies he had never suspected. "The locket you planted?" he whispered. "How long have you been planning this?" "Months," Iago replied with perverse pride. "Since the night I first saw her in his audience, since I recognized the look in their eyes. I knew it would end in disaster. Interracial relationships always do in this country. I simply accelerated the process." Othello set down his trumpet case with deliberate care, the sound echoing in the small room like a judge's gavel. "You made me doubt everything I believed in, made me suspect the woman I love of betraying me with my closest friend, made me become the kind of man I swore I'd never be: suspicious, violent, ruled by jealousy instead of love." The truth hung in the air between them, like smoke from extinguished candles. Othello's hands trembled as he reached for the fake locket that still hung around his neck beside Desdemona's real one. Twin symbols of deception and authenticity, lies and love, the duality that had torn his world apart. "I almost killed her," he said, his voice breaking. "Tonight, in her apartment, I came so close to." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak aloud the violence that Iago's poison had nearly driven him to commit. Desdemona moved closer to him, her small hand touching his arm with infinite gentleness. "But you didn't. In the end, love was stronger than lies. That has to count for something." But Othello pulled away from her touch, his eyes filled with self-loathing that cut deeper than any physical wound. "Does it? I believed him over you. I let jealousy corrupt everything pure between us. Even if we survive this, how do we live with what I became? How do you ever trust me again?" Above them, the sounds of the Blue Note continued, conversations resuming, glasses clinking, someone starting up a piano in the absence of the evening's main act. Life was moving forward while their world had stopped, frozen in this moment of revelation that had come too late to prevent the psychological damage that would haunt them forever. Iago watched their suffering with satisfaction, even in defeat. He had succeeded in destroying their innocence, their faith in each other, their belief that love could conquer all. Even if they stayed together, they would carry the scars of his manipulation forever. "You can expose me," he said with quiet venom. "Ruin my reputation, end my career. But I've already won. I've shown you what you really are beneath all that noble talk about love transcending race. You're just like every other man when pushed far enough, capable of believing the worst about the woman you claim to cherish." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy, and in Othello's eyes, Desdemona saw the reflection of a future where doubt would always lurk beneath devotion, where every argument would echo with the memory of this betrayal, where love would survive but never again be pure. The final confrontation unfolded not on a stage, but in the narrow confines of that basement storage room where instruments slept between performances and dreams went to die. The weight of truth had settled over them like ash from an extinguished fire. And in its wake came the terrible reckoning that follows when lies are finally stripped away to reveal the damage they have caused. Othello stood frozen between his past and an uncertain future, the two lockets around his neck telling the story of his journey from love to betrayal to devastating self-knowledge. The man who had commanded audiences with his musical genius now seemed diminished, hollowed out by the realization of how completely he had been manipulated, how easily his love had been corrupted into something monstrous. 20 years, Iago continued, his voice carrying the bitter satisfaction of a man who had finally been allowed to speak his deepest truths. 20 years I've watched inferior musicians claim credit for my work, watched pretty faces and exotic backgrounds sell records while true artistry went unrecognized. You think your little romance was special? You were just another mark. Another ego to be exploited. Emilia moved toward the door, her drummer's sense of timing telling her that this confrontation needed to move beyond words before someone got hurt. We need to get the police. This man has committed fraud, harassment, maybe even attempted murder if Othello had gone through with. No police, Desdemona said quickly, her blue eyes meeting Othello's dark ones across the small room. This isn't about criminal justice. This is about something deeper, about whether love can survive being poisoned and still grow back stronger. The club above had fallen strangely quiet, as if the entire village jazz scene was holding its breath, waiting to see how this story would end. Through the ceiling, they could hear muffled conversations, the clink of glasses being set down, footsteps moving across wooden floors that had witnessed 1,000 musical revelations. But down here, in this cramped storage room surrounded by silent instruments, the only sound was breathing and the distant hum of heating pipes. Cassio found his voice first, his youth giving him courage that his elders had lost. Iago, you're sick. You've destroyed 3 people's lives because you couldn't handle your own failures. But it's not too late to make this right. Make it right? Iago's laughter was sharp as broken cymbal. How do you make right the fact that Othello was ready to kill the woman he claims to love based on nothing more than manufactured evidence? How do you make right the fact that Miss High Society here was slumming it with a black man to rebel against Daddy? How do you make right 20 years of being invisible? Othello's hand slowly curled into fists, and for a moment, violence hung in the air like discord, waiting to resolve into harmony or chaos. But then he looked at Desdemona, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since Iago's poison had begun its work, and saw not the faithless woman his jealousy had imagined, but the brave soul who had risked everything for love. I was ready to kill you, he said softly, his voice heavy with horror at his own capacity for destruction. In your apartment tonight, when you couldn't explain the locket, when my mind was so twisted by his lies that I couldn't see the truth standing right in front of me. I came closer to becoming a monster than I ever thought possible. Desdemona stepped toward him, her hand reaching out but stopping just short of touching his face. But you didn't. At the last moment, something in you recognized the lie. That's what brought you here, what made you listen when you overheard his confession. Love saved us, Othello. Damaged, poisoned, nearly destroyed, but it saved us. The moment stretched between them like a held note that could resolve into major or minor, triumph or tragedy, depending on choices that hung in the balance like coins spinning through the air. Above them, someone had started playing piano, not Cassio's virtuosic style, but simple, honest chords that spoke of hope persisting in darkness. Iago watched their tentative reconciliation with rage that had nowhere left to go. His master plan had succeeded in destroying their innocence but failed to destroy their connection, and that failure was more bitter than any professional disappointment he had ever suffered. You think this ends here, he snarled. You think you can just walk away and pretend none of this happened? The whole scene knows about your relationship now. The scandal, the publicity, the damage to both your reputations, that's all real, whether my evidence was fake or not. Iago's words cut through the fragile hope that had been building between Othello and Desdemona like a discordant note shattering a perfect chord progression. The truth of his observation hung heavy in the storage room air, even with his deception exposed. The damage to their reputations, their careers, their place in both the jazz world and society at large, remained devastatingly real. But it was Desdemona who found her voice first, her words carrying the strength that had sustained her through weeks of scandal and isolation. You're right about one thing, Iago. The damage is real. The whispers, the lost opportunities, the doors that have closed, none of that magically disappears because we've uncovered your lies. She turned to face Othello fully, her blue eyes reflecting the amber light from the single bulb that illuminated their makeshift courtroom. But here's what you never understood about love: it's not fragile. Real love doesn't crumble at the first sign of pressure. It gets tested, bruised, even broken. But if it's genuine, it finds a way to heal stronger than before. Othello listened to her words as if hearing music for the first time, his musician's ear detecting harmonies he had missed, while Iago's poison clouded his judgment. "I don't know if I deserve forgiveness," he said quietly. "I let jealousy turn me into someone I don't recognize. I was ready to destroy the most precious thing in my life, because I couldn't trust what my heart knew to be true." "Deserve?" Desdemona stepped closer, finally bridging the distance between them. "Love isn't about deserving, Othello. It's about choosing each other. Again and again. Even when the world tells us we're wrong. Especially when the world tells us we're wrong." From his corner, Cassio watched this reconciliation with relief, flooding his young features. The nightmare of being caught between them, of carrying the guilt of a betrayal he had never committed, was finally lifting. "What about him?" he asked, nodding toward Iago, who stood trapped between instrument cases and his own exposed malice. Emilia lowered her drumstick, but kept her distance from the man who had orchestrated so much suffering. "The music community needs to know what he did. Other musicians, other relationships, they deserve to be protected from this kind of manipulation." Iago's composure finally cracked completely. Cornered, his grand plan exposed, his victim refusing to stay destroyed, he lunged toward the door with desperate fury. But Othello's reflexes, honed by years of stage performance and street survival, caught him before he could escape. They grappled briefly among the stored amplifiers and music stands, a violent dance that ended with Iago pinned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's over," Othello said, his voice carrying the finality of a last note fading into silence. "Whatever poison you've been carrying all these years, whatever resentment has been eating you alive, it ends here." Above them, the sounds of the blue note had changed. Word was spreading through the club about the drama unfolding in the basement, and musicians who had known all the players for years were beginning to understand the scope of Iago's deception. There would be consequences, professional, social, legal. The jazz community, despite its reputation for tolerating eccentric behavior, had little patience for those who betrayed its fundamental values of authenticity and mutual support. As if summoned by the collective weight of justice, footsteps echoed on the basement stairs. Detective Ray Sullivan, the Irish cop whose beat included the village and who had been nursing a beer at the bar upstairs, appeared in the doorway. His weathered face took in the scene with professional assessment, the overturned music stands, Iago pinned against the wall, the tension crackling between the assembled musicians. "Heard there might be some trouble down here," Sullivan said, his hand resting casually near his service weapon. "Someone want to explain what's going on?" Emilia stepped forward, her drummer's sense of timing telling her this was the moment for truth to finally have its full accounting. "Officer, this man has been conducting a campaign of harassment and fraud against these people. We have witnesses to his confession of planting false evidence and manipulating evidence to destroy their relationship." Sullivan's eyes narrowed as he looked at Iago, recognizing the type of small-time operator who caused big-time trouble. In his 15 years on the village beat, he had seen every variation of jealousy, ambition, and resentment that could poison human relationships. This case had all the elements that made his job both fascinating and depressing. "That true?" he asked Iago directly. "You been playing games with these people's lives?" Iago's response was barely above a whisper, but in the confined space, every word carried the weight of final confession. "Everything I did was legal. Buying a locket, having conversations, sharing observations, none of that's against the law." "Maybe not," Sullivan replied, pulling out his notebook. "But fraud is. harassment is. And if you've been threatening people or interfering with their livelihoods, that's definitely against the law. The arrest happened with the subdued efficiency that characterized Detective Sullivan's 15 years of village policing. Iago Bennett was handcuffed without resistance, his face a mask of resigned bitterness as the weight of his actions finally settled into legal consequences. The charges would be multiple: fraud, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and possibly conspiracy. But more damaging than any criminal penalty would be his complete exile from the jazz community that had been his life's work. As Sullivan led Iago up the basement stairs, the man who had orchestrated so much destruction turned back one final time. "You think this ends it?" he called to Othello and Desdemona, his voice carrying the hollow echo of defeat. "You think love conquers all? Wait until the real world gets hold of you again. Wait until the novelty wears off and you're left with nothing but the differences that divide you." But his words fell on deaf ears. Othello and Desdemona stood together in the amber light of the storage room, their hands finally intertwined, their eyes meeting with the recognition of two people who had traveled through hell and emerged scarred but unbroken. Around them, Cassio and Emilia began collecting the scattered instrument cases and sheet music, restoring order to the physical space as if it could somehow restore order to their disrupted lives. "The club's waiting," Cassio said softly, nodding toward the ceiling where the sounds of conversation had given way to an expectant silence. "They want to know you're okay. They want to hear you play." Othello looked down at his trumpet case, the instrument that had been his voice when words failed, his salvation when the world seemed determined to destroy him. "I don't know what I have left to say." "Then don't say anything," Desdemona replied, her hand gentle on his arm. "Just play what you feel. Let the music tell the truth that words can't handle." They climbed the stairs together, emerging into the main room of the Blue Note like survivors returning from a war zone. The club was packed, but the usual buzz of conversation had died to whispers. Musicians, critics, fans, and curious observers filled every table and lined the walls, all waiting to witness what would happen next in a story that had captivated and divided the village jazz community. Othello walked to the small stage where his trumpet gleamed under the amber lights, and for a moment, he simply stood there, looking out at faces that reflected every emotion, from sympathy, to judgment, to hope. Then he lifted the instrument to his lips and began to play. The melody that emerged was unlike anything he had ever performed before. It began with pain raw, unfiltered anguish that spoke of betrayal and loss, and the terrible things that people do to each other in the name of love and ambition. But gradually, the music evolved, finding harmonies within the discord, discovering beauty in the broken places, building towards something that was neither triumph nor tragedy but simply truth. Cassio joined him on piano, his young fingers finding chords that supported without competing, that lifted the melody without overwhelming it. Emilia took her place behind the drums, her steady rhythm providing the heartbeat that anchored the improvisation. Together, they created music that transcended the scandal, the manipulation, the damage that had nearly destroyed them all. As the song reached its climax, Othello's eyes found Desdemona in the audience, and in that moment, everything else fell away: the whispers, the judgment, the uncertain future they would have to navigate together. There was only the music and the love that had survived its first real test, wounded but intact, forever changed but not forever broken. The final note hung in the air like a prayer, and in the silence that followed, the Blue Note held its collective breath. Then, slowly, the applause began, not the wild enthusiasm of entertainment, but the respectful recognition of something profound witnessed, something real and honest and necessary. Outside, December snow continued to fall on Greenwich Village, covering the streets where their story had unfolded with fresh white promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of their commitment to each other and to the music that had brought them together. But tonight, in this basement club where dreams came true and hearts got broken in equal measure, love had proven stronger than lies, and music had once again provided the language for truths too deep for words. The jazz age was ending, and a new era was beginning. But some things love, music, the human capacity for both destruction and redemption, remained eternal, as the rhythm that keeps time for every generation's dance between heartbreak and hope.